So, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, welcome to this afternoon session. I'm more than happy to introduce our second keynote speaker for this conference, Professor Michael Moser from University of Vienna, who will guide us through the myths and truths regarding the history of the Ukrainian language. Michael is a professor in Vienna, but also in Budapest and in Munich. And he's a historical linguist, but combining the linguistic aspects with the history of culture and nation.
Thank you so much, Professor Sova, or as I usually address you, Wojciech. And thank you for the entire team, which made it possible that we are meeting here. We have been together at this conference, at this wonderful conference, and at several events. It's a genuine pleasure, and I'm especially grateful because I came to Wrocław the third time, this time, but the last time was in the 1990s. I can tell you Wrocław has changed a lot. And if it was a lovely city, then it is still a lovely city, but it is maybe even lovelier. Time to come back soon. But now, let's talk about some issues that are in fact connected to a certain extent with yesterday's keynote, because we came to the conclusion that it would be a nice idea to rethink certain myths regarding Ukraine and also the Ukrainian language. And of course, my title is provocative because everybody among you might ask now, okay, we can talk about myths, but where would he know the truth or the truths from? Well, I don't know the truth. I just have some ideas that we could maybe call anti-myths. And you know that these myths that we are fighting against right now are not just a scholarly issue, they are very dangerous, because you might have noticed that the Ukrainian language has turned into a cause for this war, although it allegedly doesn't even exist. So that's, I would say, a very typical Russian imperial approach to truths, based on a lot of genuine paradoxes. It's gonna be kind of a tour de force anyway, and I'm aware of the fact that not everybody among you is really very familiar with Ukraine, and that's normal. I mean, you can tell me so many things from your sphere. I have to apologize in advance if I should overburden you. This is not really my intention, but I think that my main points will be very understandable. Okay, so let's talk about the structure of this talk. It will be really a tour de force in a sense, because I would try to dive into medieval times with you and discuss the question what kind of language this might have been that appears in our textbooks to date as Old Russian. And I can usually offer you some own findings. So yes, it will be an overview, but I'm used to asking questions that maybe haven't been asked before. I think that this is one of the things we should do in scholarship, and these questions may be very simple ones. I will now, in a while, maybe amaze you with a question and with the fact that this question has never been asked before. So then we will talk about early modern Ukrainian, early modern times, 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, and a little bit about Ukrainian-Polish relations and about the way how we could assess them, because the Russian myth has it that Ukraine is basically Russian only tortured by Polish influence, or something like this. And this is amazing for people like me who love Ukrainian and Polish to the same extent, and who do not despise Russian, by the way, not at all. How could I? How would I? Then I will shed light very briefly on a fact that is also underrated in Slavic studies and beyond, I guess, the fact that precisely the territories of Ukraine are really crucial for the development of the great liturgical language of the Slavs, Church Slavonic. Because we are used to Russian imperial descriptions of these issues, and they tell us all the time that these are just Russian things. And my students tell me that some of these guys were Russian. They were not. And this is important, not because I'm thinking about blood and genes or whatever. No, it's about cultural traditions. It's about the history of education, the history of learning, and this is important. So, yeah, is Ukrainian just the same Russian language, only corrupted by Polish influence? Never, ever. Not even from the outset. And then I will briefly discuss some questions that are important for Ukrainian studies, and I will allow myself to criticize Ukrainian master narratives, not Russian master narratives, but Ukrainian master narratives. The last point will be very brief because I'm sure you have heard a lot about it, and I wrote books about it, but I think that this should not be the main issue, and we could come back to the issue after my presentation. So that's about the history of the Ukrainian language after 1991. And once again, my keynote will be maybe not so much a keynote about truths, but more a keynote about anti-myths. You know that the Russian story has it that everything Russian is not only great from the outset, it is also something essentialist. Russia was there, is there, and will be there. And now you see the territories we are talking about in the 9th century. And you see that wherever Russia is now, there were no Slavs at all back at that time. Genuine nationalists know this, and they draw the wrong conclusion, as if this were bad. Why should it be bad? Why should Baltic tribes or Finno-Ugrian tribes be a bad admixture to Slavic blood? No, but it's just a matter of fact. Yeah. And it also has some consequences for the history of languages, but we will not go into details here, maybe in the discussion. So then you see on the next slide this state of Rus, which in the 19th century received a new name, Kievan Rus. It was never named Kievan Rus. This is, of course, something that was invented by scholars. But the truth is that the very center, the very heart of the culture of Rus was in Kiev. And there was another major cultural center. It was of secondary importance. That's just something that would be acknowledged by everyone. That is Novgorod, in the north. I'm aware of the fact that you don't see everything on the map, but the map gives you a brief impression, a short impression, general impression of what this state of Rus was. And let's remember that most territories of modern Russia were colonialized by Slavic tribes rather late in the 12th century. And you know that this medieval state of Kievan Rus was destroyed in the mid-13th century. So that's just facts. Generally well-known facts. We also know that Rus is not very close to what many Russians think. It doesn't really give you the chance to be proud of being Russian in a modern nationalist sense, because actually it's a word borrowed from Finnic tribes. It's the word Ruotsi, which means oarsmen and Swedes. And then we know very well that in the earliest testimonies, in the chronicles, Rus, those are always Scandinavians, not the Slavs. And we see in those chronicles a clear differentiation between Rus on the one hand, that's the Varangians, the Vikings, the elites, and Slavs on the other hand. Now this very naive question, which I asked recently, the article appeared a month ago in Russian Linguistics, this very naive question was, when is this expression, the Russian language, or the language of Rus, to be more precise, Ruski язык, when was it used for the first time? It has never been asked. This very simple question, and you know, I couldn't believe it. It was after the ruin of Kievan Rus. The first cases of the use of Ruski язык, whatever, to write in the language of Rus, stems from the 60s of the 13th century. That's 20 years after the fall of Kiev. Now you could say this might be by chance, but as a matter of fact, the language of Rus, in a completely different sense, was attested much earlier, but it had a completely different meaning, a logical meaning. It was the language of the Scandinavians. Constantine Porphyrogennetos has it in his wonderful work, De Administrando Imperio. He differentiates Rossisti, Sklavinisti. in Russian means in Old Scandinavian, and in Slavic means in the Slavic language of Rus. So at some point between the 10th century and the second half of the 13th century, there must have been a shift. What we see in between is a use of other names for this language, and it's a very, very simple one. It's just the Slavic language, Slovianski jazyk. So when people tell us, okay, we shouldn't talk about Ukrainian regarding those times because this is really anachronistic, then I would say, yeah, we can discuss this. But most of these names are anachronistic, and now we know that Russian is also anachronistic if we refer to this period. Find an earlier example, I will be happy. Not happy because I'm not right, but happy because I know better then. Another myth that you might find in the textbooks is that basically this language called Old Russian was one language, and the differences were just differences between dialects. I mean, come on. If we talk about those periods, where are the differences between dialects and languages? Explain to me later, please, I will be happy. The truth is that this is just the look from a very teleological perspective. There was no Russian language then. There was no Ukrainian language then. There were Slavic dialects. And on the basis of these Slavic dialects, later on, languages were developed. It's quite easy. Not Old Russian. And the greatest miracle is another Russian imperial truth, which persists to date. The same people who say the language of this northern center, Novgorod, is unique, not only in the Russian context or in the East Slavic context or in the context of Rus. No, it's unique regarding the whole Slavic-speaking world. And now listen, that's true. It's really unique. But how can you at the same time say there was one old Russian language? I mean, everybody understands it, but this doesn't work. Also, if we talk about this liturgical language, about Church Slavonic, we are used to call those so-called recensions of Church Slavonic, even if they stem from Kiev, Russian Church Slavonic. Why? How come? I mean, those recensions receive their names based on the influence that they received from the vernaculars spoken in the environment. But Kiev was not Russian-speaking. It was definitely not Russian-speaking. The dialects that were spoken in Kiev back then were not Russian. Russian entered the territory of Kiev, if you wish, in the second half of the 17th century with Russian imperial soldiers and other people. But it was not Russian. So, of course, the recension of Church Slavonic was not Russian Church Slavonic either. That's why I always have trouble when I listen to my students when they give their presentations and when they use this terminology which they take from the textbooks. This terminology is very, very questionable. So let's switch to early modern Ukrainian. Here's another map. This is the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. What you see is, of course, names of modern states that developed out of those territories. Yeah, this is more than just a map. It gives us an idea how come that Ukrainian, and also Belarusian, by the way, developed in the way they did. I would like to stress one or two issues. I'm not going into details. Those who are more or less familiar can read the slides more or less. And you can ask questions afterwards. I would stress the following things. Yes, Polish and Ukrainian and Belarusian, they were languages in contact. Other languages were involved too, by the way. Yiddish, Lithuanian, whatever. But we have to focus on some major questions here. And early modern Ukrainian developed into a wonderful early modern written language out of the Ruthenian Chancery language. And this was also due to the fact that Polish became a wonderful early modern written language. In the second half of the 16th century, the golden age of Polish culture, and also of the Polish language, and also of the Ruthenian language in its Ukrainian and in its Belarusian shape, by the way. The impact of Polish was tremendous. I always emphasize this, and my Ukrainian colleagues are convinced that I overemphasize. But you know, I'm a Ukrainian patriot, but above all, I like truths. And the truth is so obvious. You can see it afterwards. What does it mean that this was a wonderful early modern written language? It was, in fact, a literary language, this early modern Ruthenian language, a literary language in very many ways, because it was used in very many spheres. It was used in poetry. It was used in theater. Yeah, most of you are from the English-speaking world. I don't say that Ruthenian theater was like Shakespeare. No. But it was theater. It was poetry. Something that Muscovy didn't have. Yes, Poles did exert strong impact on Ukrainians and Belarusians back in that period, but on the other hand, Poles were themselves under strong Ruthenian impact. Beginning with the fact that if Mickiewicz would have his name in genuine Polish, he would be Mickiewicz, not Mickiewicz. This is a loan from Belarusian and Ukrainian. So what you see here is, of course, something which you might not be able to read. It's a text that reminds us of the fact that in the Ruthenian lands, that means in modern Ukraine and in modern Belarus, we are confronted with a culture that is very European in very many ways. One of the facts is the simple truth that most cities in modern Ukraine were under the Magdeburg Law, which means that they had privileges in very many ways. And this is only one of the facts that does have significance for language history too, because if you have laws and privileges, then you communicate with other people in a completely different way. You are freer. And you can also develop something like education in an organized way. And the Ukrainians and Belarusians did that also under the pressure of Polish culture. They had to defend themselves against this Polish impact, which was pressure too. And now you see some very simple consequences. This document is from Lviv. It's called Instrukcja, which is from Latin, of course. And the first word used is plenipotentio, which is also from Latin. And now look for Latin words in Russian documents of that period. That will be quite a hard task. You will find them, for instance, in works written in Muscovy by Ukrainians, but not in genuine Russian works as a rule. But what would be one of the problematic things for some people? I will read you, just for those who understand some Polish or maybe some Ukrainian too, the first sentence or parts of it in the language of the original. Plenipotencju to jest zupełną moc, albo poruczęstwo wszelijakie my wsi wespól jeden za jednoho naród ruski, religii greckie, mieszczany i przedmieszczany itd., itd. And now, I'm going to be a hero. I'm going to translate this into Polish. Plenipotencje to jest zupełna moc, albo poruczęstwo wszelakie, my, itd., itd. This means that this is very, very close to Polish. Very, very close to Polish, but it's not Polish. And it's not Russian. What is it then? Yeah. It's early modern Ukrainian in its literary form, and it's very close to Polish, but it's not something that corrupted Ukrainian. On the contrary, it enriched Ukrainian. To a very high degree, I will not expand on this, but on the left side you see some other fragments from that instruction. You can't read it, not because you are unable to, because you can't see it. On the right hand, you have a Russian text from this period. It's so different. You know, it's completely different languages. Both of them were called Ruski Yazyk at that time, yeah, but they were so different. And when they encountered, they were in a difficult situation. One person said, yeah, my language is Ruski Yazyk. And the other person said, yeah, my language is Ruski Yazyk, but they just didn't understand each other. Why do we know that they didn't understand each other? Because we have translations. Texts were translated. And so they invented some new terminology. This is how the term Little Russian, Maloruski, came into being. Because it was not the same. Polish pressure, it was pressure. First of all, religious pressure. The Jesuits were very active. Polish pressure had very fruitful consequences. The Poles, some of them, Piotr Skarga, for instance, a hero of the Polish Jesuit movement, he said more or less, I'm now making things short. You Ruthenians, Ukrainians, he didn't use the word Ukrainians, you Ruthenians, you can't lead discussions with us. You even lack basic knowledge. Your language isn't developed well enough. You don't even have a Bible that we can talk about. What you have is some manuscripts shattered around. And the Ruthenians, the Ukrainians, drew a good conclusion. They didn't say, no, you are wrong, everything's fine, everything's good. No. They reinvented the liturgical language, they codified it, they printed the first complete Bible in Church Slavonic, and later on, they gave all their knowledge, which they achieved in organized education, to the Muscovites. Think about Russian Baroque authors, Русские писатели барокко. Not one Russian. All of them are Ukrainians, or people who came to Russia via Ukraine, like Simeon Politsky. So we can skip the following slide. We can now come to more recent times, and now I'm going to offer you some kind of criticism of the Ukrainian master narrative of the history of the Ukrainian standard language. What we are told in those textbooks is that there were great authors. Yeah, they are great authors. I appreciate that, and I honor that. I've even written about some of them quite a lot. I wrote a book about Shevchenko. Yeah, there was Ivan Kotoraevsky, and then HERA Kvitka, and then Taras Shevchenko. And then they tell us that there was even a grammar, the grammar by Alexa Pavlovsky. Then, of course, students who have to learn this from the textbooks will accept that. They won't ask any further questions. But if a language is just limited to fine literature, it's not a standard language. First point. Second point, Pavlovsky's grammar is something like this. It's a very small pamphlet which describes a few differences between Ukrainian and Russian, and that's it. This is not a codification. It's an interesting fact, but that's everything. So we have to think about many things that are not even discussed in the textbooks which we have. We even read somewhere everything else except for those authors is not even worth our attitude. Це не гідне уваги. This was Ukrainian. This is not worth our attention. This is from Soviet traditions. And if the Soviets say, this is not worth your attention, I feel very intrigued. So one of my major fields of work was the Ukrainian-speaking territory outside the Russian Empire. And what you can find there these are very, very rich materials, which are completely overlooked just because they are not so close to modern standard Ukrainian. But they are not Russian, they are not Polish, they are Ukrainian. And you can even find the first scholarly statements and arguments. These are more or less the first decades of scholarly Slavic studies, which state that Ukrainian is a language of its own. It's not a dialect. It's not a Polish dialect, it's not a Russian dialect. Let's be honest, you have understood that I like Polish very much. But in the 19th century, the Ukrainians were in a very bad situation because the Russians said, there is no Ukrainian language, those are Russian dialects, but many Poles said, there is no Ukrainian language, those are just Polish dialects. So it was a quite interesting struggle they had to fight, and they fought it successfully, luckily. You know that in the Russian Empire, where the majority of Ukrainians lived, Ukrainian couldn't develop like other languages developed precisely during that period because of language bans. The Russian Empire reacted to the very fact that Ukrainians began to develop their language out of the sphere of fine literature. By the way, following the Crimean War, about which we heard yesterday, the Russian Empire had a very simple rule. When the Russian Empire suffered a real defeat, then it became liberal for some years. And those were windows of opportunity for the Ukrainians, and what they did during those brief periods is just amazing. So the Crimean War ended in 1856, and then the Ukrainians created private schools, they created a Ukrainophone press, they wrote primers, not just poems, but primers for schools, and the empire said, no, you can't do that because your language doesn't exist. So they hampered the development, and then they said, yeah, Ukrainian is not a language, it's just dialects that are used by peasants, and Ukraine is not a language of culture, because they didn't admit the development, which has to be worked upon. This doesn't come out of nothing. You have to have funding, you have to have chances in order to do that. Then I have to go back. I will tell you a very brief story about the so-called years of Ukrainianization. We hear quite often from the Russian side, Ukrainian could develop so well in early Soviet times because those were the times of Korenizatsiya, indigenization. But one of the heroes of this period, which really had strong effects, the author Mykola Kulish, said it perfectly in a wonderful play, which I can recommend, Mena Mazailo. He says, you know, all this Ukrainianization is just a lie. They are doing this in order to reveal us and to kill us afterwards. He wrote this in 1928, and the movement against this Ukrainianization and all the protagonists set in 1929 and came to a brutal end in 1933. I will not talk about orthographies and other issues now, because I want to come to an end. I think Wojciech will be happy about that. I will come to a last point now. What we heard prior to the 24th of February of this year, when the war continued, but it changed dramatically. One of the statements we heard was that the Ukrainian language as such was and is just something that is linked to Ukrainian nationalism and to this state of Ukraine, which shouldn't have any right to exist, and so on and so forth. And those are Nazis, the Jew, Zelensky is a Nazi, and so on and so forth. Sorry for those stupid statements, they are not mine. You should know that Ukrainian became the only state language of Ukraine in Soviet times. In 1989. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. After 1991, the Ukrainian language developed powerfully in very many spheres. We could have done more, but we do have our achievements. And that's good. Thank you.
I think we have like a couple of minutes. We can take some questions if there are some immediate comments or intervention. Not. Thank you very much, dear Michael. Yeah. Oh no, there is someone.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Two quick questions. The first, what could you comment in the context of the presentation, the saying that dialect is a language with the army and the navy? And the second question concerning Polish impacts. What is your approach to the thesis of Mr. Beauvoir that Ukraine was for Poland, is for Poles, the same as Algeria for France? Thank you.
Thank you. So, of course, that's the elephant in the room. A language is a dialect with an army and a navy. It is not by chance that it was Max Weinreich, a specialist for the study of the history of Yiddish, who made this statement while reading a lecture at New York University on the history of Yiddish. This is typical Jewish humor at its best. The army and the navy are a good metaphor. It's about power in a much broader sense. And for instance, language in schools brings much more than an army and a navy as such. A good grammar, a good dictionary, that's really the armory we need to develop a language. And the potential to use a language in very many spheres, just like normal languages, other normal languages. Our French colleague is a very good historian, but I would rather lead this discussion with him. Comparisons always have their pluses and their minuses. I would say that I don't agree with this for many reasons, but I think this would lead us too far. But it's true, you noticed that, I appreciate the Polish impact on Ukraine and the impact of the Polish language on Ukrainian, and vice versa, by the way. But it's not a story of eternal friendship, let's be honest. The new Polish-Ukrainian friendship is actually a wonderful miracle.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments?
I wonder if you could clarify a question which is very much in the expert has kind of come up. We find this pattern in a number of places where one country is dominant, one country uses a language which is not extraordinarily different, is regarded as subservient in some sense. So in other words, the Dutch are meant to be able to understand German, the Germans don't understand Dutch. Portuguese can understand Spanish, the Spanish cannot understand Portuguese. I think we're told that Ukrainians can understand Russians, Russians can understand Ukrainian. I don't know if you comment on this or if there's anything. I see a pattern.
With great pleasure, because I think this is a question which moves a lot of people, and I would also say that this is linked to a lot of myths again. So generally we know, you are completely right, that to understand a language is not that easy. It's not only the fact that one person understands the other language more or less and the other around must be the same way. This is also linked to motivation. Do you want to understand this language? Do you really appreciate your vis-a-vis? Is this language something that attracts you? I mean, for instance, Czech and Slovak are really quite close. Usually, Slovaks understand Czech very well, but not so much the other way around. It depends. Russian and Ukrainian are actually very different. I mean, the difference is not the same as the difference between Hungarian and English. This was, of course, a joke. But if you take the languages as such, my observations tell me that Polish and Ukrainian are better understandable, mutually understandable, to a high degree, mutually understandable to a high degree than Russian and Ukrainian. Why do Ukrainians understand Russian? Because they've learned Russian. It's as easy. But I know a lot of Ukrainians from North America. Most of them originate from Western Ukraine, that's also true. But they would understand Polish much better than Russian. And it's also something you can give reasons for, because Russian is not just as a standard language based on Russian dialects. Russian dialects have a certain share in this structure of Russian, but Russian is to a very high degree based as far as the vocabulary is concerned, and of course the vocabulary is the major issue if we talk about comprehensibility, is to a very high degree shaped by a language that is completely outside this area, by Church Slavonic, which comes from modern Macedonia and Bulgaria. That's the major reason. Russian is a beautiful language, but it's a language that is not really very deeply rooted on Russian soil.
Thank you very much for all these comments. I thank you once again for this wonderful introduction into the history of Ukrainian language and basically culture through the language. Just one comment. We stop our conference right now here, and I see all of you at 5:30 at the town hall in the main square, where in the historical building we will close officially our conference. So see you around. Thank you very much. And we meet each other there. Thank you.